I'll put the enablement hub in the chat too. Share my screen again. So for anyone who's just joining, just reviewing how we can download the training content if you haven't already. So it'll be on the enablement hub link that was provided in the chat. You'll click this download training data here under the Alteryx training section, and then it will automatically download a zip file. Excuse my download folder in advance because it's a little messy, but essentially you'll click on that zip folder. We'll want to extract all. If we don't extract everything beforehand, you're going to run into some errors that we will see in Alteryx. So it's super critical that we have that extract all portion done. So then now you'll be able to use those downloaded files and it won't be in a zip folder anymore.
I also think we actually have everyone if we want to get started.
Perfect. So just to kind of introduce myself to anyone I haven't met yet, my name's Taylor. So I will be running the beginner training series. I'm from Continuous, which we are a premier partner to Alteryx. So we help out with, doing demos, trainings, one-on-one sessions, anything to really just be there as a helping hand in your Alteryx journey. So today we're going to be starting off with just an intro to Alteryx, as well as start to dive into some of the, tools that we see from a day-to-day perspective. So with that being said, I'm going to just do a little high-level overview of Alteryx itself before we start getting hands-on with the training content. Is there anyone on the call who's used Alteryx in the past?
I have, and I think some others from my team have used it a little bit.
Okay, perfect. So just to kind of break down Designer Desktop, I always like to say it's in 4 sections. The first one being our tool palette, which this is where you're going to find all the tools that you'll need in order to create and build out your workflow. Again, Alteryx is known for that, not having to be tech savvy, having that drag and drop down, option, so you don't have to worry about doing any code. This is a no code, low code environment. So again, super easy. Any tool that you want to pull from the tool palette, you'll just drag and drop in to the canvas. Now we'll be focusing on these first 3 tabs in, the next couple of training sections, as well as the parse and transform. I would say these first 5 tabs are about 80% of what your workflows will consist of. So if you can master those tools, you'll be all set. Again, there's endless amount of tools we can use in Alteryx too, so don't feel like you have to be siloed to those first 5 tabs, but it's definitely a great place to get up and started. And another thing too, if you ever have questions about a certain topic, you can always come to the search bar, like for any of my Excel users out there. If you wanted to per se, like do a VLOOKUP, it will populate a tool that it thinks would be a good suggestion for what you're trying to accomplish, as well as you'll be able to find articles in the community as to different examples of how to do VLOOKUPs in Alteryx. Or if you can't even find what you're looking for in the community, you can also ask the question to the community with some, sample data or an example, and someone will respond back to you within 30 minutes or less. I know I relied on that heavily when I was first using Alteryx, so definitely take advantage of that if you have any questions regarding that. So again, tool palette, this is where we'll grab all of our tools from. We then have our configuration window, which is the second section, I would say, in Alteryx, which this is where we'll be able to configure each tool. So you'll notice if I click on individual tools, that configuration pane changes because each tool has its own, functionality. So just being able to figure out how everything's configured is super important in our Alteryx process as well. Another thing is, again, we have over 200, 300 tools within Alteryx, and that list is ever growing. So if you ever forget later down the line on how a tool is configured, you can always come to this help tab, go to sample workflows, learn one tool at a time, and you can grab any of the tools that are in your tool palette to find examples. And so if I were to, what if I forgot how to configure the find replace tool, I can click on that and it will take me to a new tab with different examples of how I can use that. And you'll be able to, figure out what you need in order to configure it properly. Our next section is this workflow canvas. So this is where you spend a majority of your time at, just dragging in the tools, connecting them. I'm going to zoom in on here too. So the workflow is, all these tool icons that are connected together. We normally see it from a left to right perspective. So first we're reading in data, and then from there processing the information until we get that final output that we're looking for. So you'll notice that some of the tools have, these green icons. Some have, input icons, output icons. So it really just depends on, what tool we're using. So for like instance, if we're using our input data tools, most of the tools will only have what's called an output anchor because we're just feeding the data into the workflow, but we're not needing to ingest anything into the tool, if that makes sense. Whereas some other tools like the select tool, we can, use this connection to, drag and connect like so, and connect it to the select tool in order to do the configurations we need to with that data set coming through. And then our output will be, once this tool is configured, what our output will look like using the select tool. So we'll be able to see from like a step-by-step perspective what's happening with our data given the tools that we're configuring. And then the last thing I want to bring up is the results window. So you'll see right here, it'll say no data available. We need to either use Control R on our keyboard or click the run button, which is right here. So once we click the run button, we'll be able to see the data that's being transformed from step by step, like I was mentioning before. So if I just click this run button, you'll see in our results window right now, it's showing all the messages that are coming from our tools, whether it's an error, a conversion error, or warnings. So errors are what we really need to focus on, especially for best practices, because if, one tool is configured wrong and we're getting an error message, it can hinder and stop the workflow from processing from that point. So we want to ensure there's no error messages. If there's any conversion errors, that means that we're dealing with data type issues, which I won't go too heavily into right now just because we'll be focusing on it in our training series. But essentially, if we're working with, numeric values, like, we're wanting to do summation between 10 plus 10, if it's in a string data type, we're not able to perform those calculations. So we might see some conversion errors where like there's something going on with the data types and it not populating how we want to for specific values. Another thing is warnings. So warnings will not stop your workflow, but it's best practices to take a look at them to see what the warnings are saying, because it could have, we could have missing values or missing columns if we don't pay attention to the warnings. So for instance, like this union tool, which again, we'll work with the union tool later down the line in this track. But in this one, it's saying, not all ST, which is our column header, is present for all inputs we're bringing in. And then, the field state is not present in all inputs. And the reason being is we can see from our first data set, we're working with a column called state. But in our second one, instead of it being called state, it's ST. So how our union tool is configured is by the name, the naming convention at that point. So that's why we're getting that warning that, hey, we're going to populate these columns for you, but it's not showing that column for the other data set involved. So you can see it brings in all the column headers, including that ST for state, since it's not properly aligning with the state column. But again, I won't go too into the weeds of that because we'll be working with the union tool either in this session or next session. But again, just using our connections so you can see very easy, we can drag our connection and connect it to whatever tool we need. So maybe I need to use a formula tool. I can always just drag that green output anchor and connect it like so. So now whatever streams out of this will now stream into this formula. And you can tell by our output for our union tool, it's the same coming into our input tool or input anchor of the formula tool. So the last thing we're going to do for this introduction is just showing how we can, fix our errors. So with Alteryx, it's very transparent as to what the error is. So again, our tool will have a red icon like we see here to let us know that there's an error, as well as, in our messages, we'll also see that error come through right here. So we can see in our messages here that it says there's a parse error, there's an invalid type to operator. And again, if we come into this filter tool, we can also see the indication that, something is wrong here as far as the operator we're using. So right now we have it set to outlier is true, but given our outlier column and its data type, we cannot use this function. So maybe we want to use another function. So one thing we'll be doing, especially when it comes to data types, is in the result window, we see, our whole data set here, but sometimes we want to look at the data type of the column headers, which will use this metadata radio button instead. So this type column will show us what data type we're working with. So in our case, our outlier is a V string. So we want to make sure we're using operators that correlate to V string. So in this case, I'm going to change this, and maybe we want to do something where the outlier is not null instead. So you can already see that, we're not seeing any red, which is a good indication we shouldn't receive an error message. So now if I click the run button again, we'll now see that that error message goes away and it fully processes our data. And now we have, our outputs given this filter tool. So that's pretty much a high-level overview of Alteryx itself. I'll stop right there to see if there's any questions before we start getting into the tools itself. I'll take silence as we're good to start here. So again, we're going to grab our files from that zip folder that we extracted. So again, it should look like this where you have, it should say like Alteryx Series Beginner. I downloaded it multiple times, so that's why we see that 4 there. And then we should have a folder called Alteryx Series Beginner again. And then we have 4 different folders. The one that we're going to focus on is this training workflows folder. And if we click on that, we are going to grab our first template that we're going to work with. So you'll grab this D1.2 reading data template. And all you'll need to do if you have Alteryx downloaded is double click on that. And what will happen is it will populate in Alteryx. Now, another way of you navigating to opening up the file too is if you come to this file section, just like how we would in Word, like, Word or Excel, we can, come to open recent. We can also come to open workflow where we're able to browse on our local desktop. So, wherever you have your zip file downloaded, which I'm assuming will probably be in your downloads folder, you'll just look for that. Again, navigate to that training workflow folder to grab our reading data and just open it, and it will populate just like how we see here. So I'll give everyone like 30 seconds to just kind of get that up. Let me know if there's any issues or errors trying to open that template. So our reading data is in our data sets for us to clean, prep, do our aggregations, and then get that desired output that we're looking for. So this is a pretty crucial step in our process because this is where we'll be, pretty much giving the template to Alteryx of what we're working with here. So whether we need to connect to Snowflake, connect to SQL Server, or connect to flat files, this will be super important in our process. So our first tool that we're going to work with is the input data tool. So again, it's going to be in our in and out tab. Our color corresponds to the color here. So if you ever have troubles looking for the tool, you can just use this color to kind of figure out which tab it is, as well as most of the tools we'll be working with by default will be in your favorites tab as well. So you can always just use this as a guide, unless you can't find the tool that we're trying to use. So in our case, we want to use the input data tool. So again, we'll want to drag and drop that onto the canvas. So if we just grab that input data tool, drag and drop, we'll see that configuration pane open up for us to, do the configurations that we need. So in our first case scenario, what we want to do is read in a CSV file called 2013 counties. So in this case, what we'll do is click the setup connection. Now, if you have a different version of Alteryx, you may see like 3 dots right here or a drop down arrow. All of those will still navigate us to the next screen. So just click on that if that's what you do have in your designer. And then again, you'll be able to see any of the recent files that we've used in the past. What we want to do though is go to files, and we can either drag and drop in our 2013 counties file, or we can select a file and browse on our local desktop. So we're going to click select a file. And from here, I want to navigate to my input data. So again, just being able to know where your zip folder is. So if I wanted to come to my downloads, again, I would want to look for this Alteryx Beginner 4 without the zip indicator. I would double click on that Alteryx Series Beginner. And then we'll want to click on that input data because this is where all of our input files will be located. So in our case, we're looking for that 2013 county CSV file. And if we see here, we have all of our data files. I would always make sure you can check what file, type that you have, because sometimes it may be on Excel, sometimes it may be on CSV, so you won't see all the files in the folder. So sometimes that can get a little scary, especially because you're like, where's my file? But you'll see if I change it to Excel, we only see our Excel files here. But in our case, we'll just leave it as all files just so we can see all of our input files coming in. In our case, again, we want to grab that 2013 county CSV file. We can also, tell that this is the correct type because hovering over it, it says comma separated value file. So we know we're working with the correct one here. So once I, select that file, we'll see a preview of the first 100 records coming in. Now, depending on what file type we're working with, this options pane will change. So if we want to, change how many records we bring in, maybe I only want to bring in the first, 10 records, I could select the value here, and so we'll only see the first 10 records or 10 rows that we're going to bring in. But we'll leave that blank because we want to bring in all the data here. We'll see our file format is set to CSV. And then I'm going to go over the ones that I feel like are super important. Output file name as field. This we could output the full path of where that file is located, or you can grab the file name. I've seen this in cases where we're pulling in multiple files at once, and maybe we want to indicate which file that's coming from, just so we can group by that at a certain point in time, so we can, separate them into their own sheets or own files later down the line. But in our case, we're just going to leave this as no. We don't want to bring in the file path with it. Again, first row contains field names. We can check this off to ensure that, the first row is going to be our column header names. If we uncheck that, then it's going to just be part of our rows or records, which in our case, we want this, in our header position with employee name, job title, and so forth. Another huge one that I see used a lot is the start data import online. So maybe some of your Excel files or CSV files, your headers don't start at, record 1. Maybe it starts at record or row 5. If I were to refresh this, you'll see that instead of seeing that employee name or job title, we now see a name and, the job title itself, instead of our actual header names, because we're starting the import online or row 5 instead of, again, on row 1 like we originally had it. So those are the primary things I would say to focus on when it comes to the output options. But other than that, we have everything ready to go. So all we'll need to do now is click the run button or do Control R on your keyboard. And now our output, you'll see, the exact preview that we see here, the employee name, job title, all the way up to agency. In our results window, we can also see that there's 11 fields, which equals to our 11 columns, as well as we have 15,000 records that we're working with in this data set. Now that we have that configured, we're going to move on to the Excel file. So again, we're going to drag and drop in the input data tool. Very similar setup to CSV, except we have one more additional step. So if we click that setup connection, again, in this case, we want to grab the controller San Francisco file. So if we come to the setup connection, go to files, select files, and then grab that controller San Francisco city data year file. It's a mouthful to say. We'll double click on that and you'll see there's a new pane that opens up. So this is where we're able to select which sheet from the Excel file we want to bring in. So if I click this drop down, you'll see that we have from year 2003 all the way up until 2012. In our case, we're just going to leave it on the first sheet, which is our 2003, and we're going to import that. We can also import a list of sheet names if we want to bring in all sheets in at once. Now we can only do that if they have the same schema, aka the same amount of column headers and the same naming conventions, or else we'll run into errors. But we'll see how that works in a second here. Another thing is too, just like kind of how we can set what line we need to import, we can also select a range if we need to only bring in a specific, group of records instead of the whole file itself. But in this case, we're just going to keep it simple. Grab the year 2003. We'll click OK. And now we'll see again that first 100 records data preview. And it looks like all of our column header names are coming in correctly, which is great. Again, we have similar features to the CSV file, the record limit. We can start the import on a certain line, as well as we can uncheck or check this first row contains data. Now that we have that set, we'll click that run button again. And now we can see our output is again that data set. We're working with 9 fields here and 155 records. I don't have my Teams chat open, so is there any questions in the chat or any questions on how to configure the input data tool so far? If I'm moving too fast at any point in time, just let me know, because I do tend to go on tangents. So just let me know if I need to reiterate something or slow down on a certain tool that we're configuring. Now, the next one we're going to work with is the select tool. Now, this doesn't bring in your data, but this tool is critical in every single workflow that I've seen. So if we come to the preparation tab, or again in your favorites tab as well, you'll find the select tool here. And we're going to connect it with that input data tool that's already pre-configured right here. So you should have the San Francisco 2011 CSV file. and now we connected it to our select tool. Now again, when we're connecting the tool, you can place it close enough to where you'll see, some dotted lines, which means it's going to connect. If you don't want it to connect, we can also, put it in a place where we don't see those gray dotted lines anymore. You can also, if it accidentally connects or you want it to connect to a different tool instead, you can always highlight on that connection, right click on it, and you should see a delete connection option. It's on my other screen right now, that's why you're not able to see it. But you'll see that option to delete the connection and start over. So I can always just do that. And then we can use that output anchor to reconnect with that select tool. Now, the reason that the select tool is super important for our workflow is one, we're able to change column header names here. We can also change the column position. We can also change the data type. So again, like I was mentioning before, if you're working with string data types, but there need to be numeric, this is where we would change that and make sure that, we have the correct sizing for the values that we're bringing in. Now, to learn more about the data types, there is a link in here. If you were to click on this, text box right here, and this link will take you to the data types cheat sheet. And so you'll know which data types are best, suitable for your use case. So for our select tool, we're just going to change a couple things around just so we can see how the select tool works. So maybe I want to change the employee name and I want to rename it to just name. Maybe I want to rename the job title to just job. And then for these base paves, I want to, change that because again, that should be a numeric value. So if I click this drop down for type, there's multiple different numeric ones we can work with. The int16 to int64 are working with whole numbers. So if you're not working with decimal places, then I would suggest using this. But in our case, since we're working with base pay and working with double or working with decimals, I would use either fixed decimal, float, or double. I normally use double just for the precision. And you'll see that that size automatically changes based off our, data type that we're using.
Also, just to clarify, so for the float, double, and fixed decimal, that's just how many decimal places or how large that value set that you're going to input is. So having multiple characters will mean it's bigger. So that's why the double would be beneficial because you have more decimals or a larger number, just for clarity's sake.
Yeah, thank you. And again, you can always just reference that data type, reference sheet if you're having trouble deciding which one to use. It definitely gives some good clarity as to, which direction to go as far as data types. Now, let's say we want to drop some columns too. For instance, like this notes column. I believe if we look at our input, we're working with some null values. And if we come here, we could just drop the year. Maybe we want to drop the notes and agency. So we should see, reduction of fields after we run this. Another thing is maybe we want to reorder things. So if I were to highlight on like job title, for instance, and maybe we want to put that first, we can use this up and down arrow to move the columns where we need it to. So if I were to, just use that up arrow once, now that job title is going to be in that position. So with that, I'm going to click the run button just so we can see what happens here. And now we'll see our output. So we started again with 11 fields. And if we click on our output anchor, we can see that we now have 8 fields, which makes sense since we dropped 3 of the columns. We also have our new columns, or not new columns, but renamed columns. So our job title is now called job, and we also have it in the first position now. We have our name column instead of employee name. And then one thing we want to also check is to make sure that base pay is changed to double. So if we click on this metadata in the results window, we can see our base pay was also changed to double, which is exactly what we're looking for here. And also we'll go over how to like change select tools, embedded select tools, and how to change, multiple data types at a time, in a later section. So, if you're wondering, like, do I have to, go through each individual one to change that data type? No, you don't. There's some workarounds using the select tool. A really great thing too is the select tool used to not have the search option where you can search, the column name. Before, you would just have to look for it yourself. Whereas now, if you're looking for a specific column, especially if you're working with hundreds and hundreds of fields, you can just find it in the search bar, make the configurations you need to, and then you'll be all set.
The other thing that's nice about just the search, as a quick note, if you name things of a similar type with a similar naming convention, you can like select all of them or do a bulk change to all of them at one point. So if you know you're going to input a bunch of values, for instance, if you had value underscore whatever the value type is, then you can make bulk changes to things like that. Also on the select tool, Taylor, I'm not sure if you covered this, but the unknown box at the bottom. So that's if you have a new tool that comes in and it somehow starts having a new column. For example, you have an Excel file that you usually update, and then one day you add an extra column to that Excel file. That next time that you run it, and now you're still pointing at that same Excel file, but it has an extra column, that will come through as unknown. So that means that anything that isn't in this exact list will start being utilized. So that will be selected.
Yeah. So you won't have to worry about, especially if you have the unknown selected, it's dynamically going to ingest those column headers. So you don't have to worry about selecting those headers, especially when you have a huge workflow where you need it to process through without it, having an issue. So definitely would keep the unknown selected unless you do want to have like a static, column headers, like you only want to bring in these 8 fields, for instance, then I would suggest using, deselecting that unknown option. But in most cases, I see you'll want to keep that selected since most of the files you work with, you'll end up adding new column headers to that specific file. Awesome. So we're gonna navigate back to the in and out palette. In this case, we're gonna use the browse tool, which this one we don't have to configure at all, which is great. All we'll need to do is drag and drop, connect it with that input data tool. And you'll notice it just says exactly like how our results window is if we don't run our workflow for the first time, is that there's just no data available. So we'll need to just click the run button in order to view it. So what this browse tool is for is to get, I like to say, a bird's eye view of the data. So you'll be able to see all of our column headers and the values that are associated with our columns. We can also see how many times that specific value is repeated. So in our case, like for employee name, Kevin Lee is repeated 9 times. So this kind of gives you insight if there's any duplicates, which there's also for duplication, there is a tool called the unique tool where we'll be able to, reduce the amount of duplicates that we see so you don't have to run into that problem too. So again, just getting some more insight on our columns. Maybe I want to select one of the column header names and it will give us some insight depending on which data type we're working with, whether, it's the length statistics for our specific value. This one that I really like to focus on, which you'll also notice in the results window that it has these like green icons or yellow icons. So what that indicates is, if we're working with null values, if the values are okay, that means that we have values that are appropriate for that column. So in this case, like if I were to highlight over employee name, 100% of our values are okay, which is exactly what we're looking for when we're trying to process out the data. We'll also see, if there's any null values, which will be highlighted in yellow. So in our case for notes, you can see if I highlight on that, it's 100% null. Versus I know right now some of these suggest that there are a lot of null values. But if we were to highlight on that column header, we can see there's actually 99% null values. It's just because we're looking at 36,000 records here. Empty values, again, it's just any like empty values versus a null. So in our case, we're in this, total pay and benefits, we're not working with any empty or any not okay values. Not okay values normally just mean we're working with values that have trailing and leading spaces. So most of the time we'll want to clean that up using things like a data cleansing tool, which again, we'll be using in a later section here. The browse tool is also great for if you're working with reporting tools. You'll notice when you're trying to build out reports with the reporting tools that a lot of the tools you can't view the images unless you're using a browse tool. So just keep in mind if the tool output says like needs a browse tool in order to view, you'll just need to bring in that browse tool and you'll be good to go. One other key thing too is if we see our input, you can see that we have 36,000 records, but in parentheses, it says partial results, which this indicates that we're only looking at around 9,000 records of our 36,000 records. So we're not seeing all the values within just this, sample right here. Now, again, any changes that we make to the data set, it's going to apply to all 36,000 records. It's just right now within our results, you're not going to see all the changes made in that 36,000 records. So the browse tool is really important because if we click on it, you can see that we don't have that partial results listed anymore. And now we can view all 36,000 records. So if there's certain IDs that we need to look at, we can come to the search bar and look for it and just make sure the correct changes were applied to the specific records or rows that we're looking for. So we have a couple more for this section. So the next one is, sorry, our text input tool. So instead of bringing in like a flat file or setting up a connection to a database, we can also use what's known as a text input tool to use dummy data or ingest our own manual data. So if I were to drag and drop in this text input tool, you'll see this kind of blank configuration here. So we're able to create, columns, records, and everything like that within this text input tool just by simply typing in here. Now I see this used a lot, especially if we're trying to create like a VLOOKUP table that like will not change. I've seen in cases where, we also need this as a reference point, like our VLOOKUP, where we have, unique IDs, and then we need some, extra columns that we need associated with that unique ID. So whether you're using your own file that you already have, or you could use a text input tool if you want to manually change the data as well, you can always do that. You can also, if you want to bring in a text input tool to use, but you have a like file that you want to base it off of already, you can use this folder option to import the file that you're looking for, and then that data will be ingested in here, and then you can make any edits or changes that you need to within here. But in our case, we're going to just create our own data straight from just this configuration. So in our, practice problem here, what we want to do is have a city column and a state column of the last 5 cities you visited. I'm just going to do 2 for now, just so we get the gist of it. So in this case, let's say we have a column called cities. So again, where you see the asterisk, that's where you want to start typing. And then if I tab over to that asterisk again, I can type in state. So now I have 2 columns populated, one called city and one called state. And if I were to run this right now, we'll see that we have null values for that first record because we haven't put anything in there. So now if we want to create those records, we can highlight on, that first record associated with the city name, and let's type in Orlando. If I were to type or tab over, we can now type in Florida. And then if I were to click enter, you'll see a new record is created, which we can tell by the 2 as an indication that it created that second record. And so now from here, if we want to type in another city, I live in Charlotte, so I'm just going to type in Charlotte, and then I'll just put NC. So now we have two records here. So if we were to run this again, we should be able to see those new records populated. So now we see our output here, and we have those two records like we have in our, dummy data that we created. Again, we could keep, creating records. One thing to just keep mind of if you're using the text input tool, if you accidentally create records, again, we'll end up seeing null values. So just keep that in mind when you're working with this tool. If you ever need to, delete this, what you could do is just like drag and highlight over all the records that need to be deleted. And then this is pretty faint right now, but you can see the delete drop down. All you'll have to do is click on that. You can delete all, which will delete all the content in there. In our case, we're just wanting to delete the records or rows. So we can just do the rows and you'll see that data will be cleaned back up. So our input data tool, we're going to bring in again. Now, I was mentioning earlier how, we could bring in multiple files at once. So there's two different ways to go about that, right? So if we want to bring in multiple files, we can use what's called the wildcard using either an asterisk or a question mark. And what we would need to do in order for us to use the wildcard is to have the appropriate naming conventions. So when you start to build out your workflows, you'll start to realize how important naming conventions are in Alteryx. I believe we just mentioned earlier with the select tool, being able to make edits to multiple columns that have the same kind of naming convention can be super helpful, especially when you're using that search option. So same kind of rules apply for the input data tool here. So in our case, what we want to do is read in these three files, the San Francisco 2011, 2012, and 2013 CSV files. So we can notice that there's a similar pattern. The only thing that's changed is the year. So what we'll do is bring in that input data tool again, and we're going to set up a connection to one of those following files. So again, just like how we've done in the past, we'll do set up connection, click the Files tab, select File, and then we'll look for one of these files. So I'm just going to grab the 2011 one since that's the first one I see. And you'll see that we have our whole entire file path here from our downloads folder all the way up until that Alteryx series beginner and then the input data folder. So we want to look for our file name, which will be all the way at the end of our file path here. So in our case, the first thing we're going to do is bring in an asterisk wildcard, which represents one or more characters. What that means is it needs to at least have one or more character present. Where we use the asterisk is going to replace that one or more characters that are present there. So if we delete that 2011 and put an asterisk, what that will do is bring in any of our files that mention 2011, 2013, 2012. So it at least needs to have one digit. So it needs to at least have -2 and so forth in order for that asterisk to be present there. So now that we have this asterisk, when we run this, we should see all three files imported. So if we click run, how we can determine if, those files came in is if we click on our input data tool, we can come to our messages and it should show us three separate files that we're bringing in. Now, in this case, we brought in 2011 and 2012, but you'll see here that there's a warning message. And that warning message is that the San Francisco 2013 CSV file has a different number of fields, so it will be skipped. So again, the warning will not, stop the process of our workflow, but it's letting us know that this 2013 file is not going to be present with our input data tool. So again, super important if we're bringing in multiple files at once, that it shares the same number of fields, the same schema, or else we're going to run into this issue. Another way we could check it too is our year column. If we wanted to bring in a browse tool and check to see if 2012 or 2011 in this case are mentioned, we could connect that browse tool, come to our year column, and you'll see 2012 and 2011 is listed, which is exactly what we're looking for here. So we have one more thing I want to go over with you. So again, in our last example with the CSV files, we brought in all files at once, but maybe we have an Excel file that we want to bring all sheets in at once. So how we can do that is using what's called the dynamic input tool to dynamically bring in each sheet by sheet. So we'll be able to use the input data tool and the dynamic input tool together in order to do that. Again, it will be super important for our schemas to still be the same, just like in our last example. So we might run into warnings or error messages dependent on if the sheets are not all, the same kind of schema. So the first thing we want to do in this example, we're going to work with that San Francisco Excel file that we did in the past. And instead of just bringing in year 2003, we're going to bring in all the years. So what we'll do is bring in that input data tool. We'll do setup connection. You should find it in your recents, but I'll just navigate to it in our input data folder just in case. We'll grab that controller file, and then instead of us selecting a specific sheet name, we're going to do import only the list of sheet names. So once we click OK, we should see sheet names and all of our individual sheet names listed here. The reason being is, again, we're going to feed it into our dynamic input tool to dynamically change what sheet we're looking at each time for it to actually output all of our sheets at once. So if we click the run button here, all we're going to see is a column named sheet names with year 2003 all the way up until 2012. Now, the dynamic input tool is in our developer tab, which is all the way over to the right. Now, I would just suggest, if you can't find the tab, to just type it in the search bar, and we can drag and drop in the tool like so, and just connect it to the input data tool that way. Again, you should see it all the way over here if you want to just grab it that way as well. So now we're going to set up similar steps to what we did with the input data tool. We're going to click that edit button, and you'll see we'll have a similar pane to what we see with the input data tool, where we can click the setup connection option. And then since we just used that file, we're going to just click that controller Excel file. And in this case, again, we still want it to be import only the list of sheet names because we still need to dynamically change it sheet by sheet. If we leave it at year 2003, it's going to become static, and we're only going to look at 2003 in this instance. So super important to, select the import only the list of sheet names. So again, similar to what we saw with the input data tool, we only see the sheet names listed here. Once we say OK, the main step in this for the dynamic input to work correctly is we need to read in a list of data sources, aka we're going to use our sheet name, which is our field, to then perform an action to change the sheet name each time we have a new sheet come through. So if we click this drop down, we can see sheet names is the only one we have available anyway. And the action we want to do, there's multiple things we could. It's append suffix to file table name or prepend prefix. We're not working with any changes to the file name itself, so we're not going to use either option. Now, what we want to use is this change file table name option, which essentially means we're changing the sheet name each time. This change entire file path I've seen used a lot too if you're working with multiple different file paths and you're wanting to extract again those files. We can change the entire file path each time, so then it brings in all those files in at once. But in this case scenario, we're only working with our sheet names, so we just want to change the file table name. Now that we have that configured, I want us to click the Run button. And now we'll see from even our messages here that our dynamic input tool is bringing in multiple different sheet names. And we know this because it's pointed to the same file, but in parentheses is our sheet name. So we have year 2009, 2011, and so forth. So we know this is accurately bringing it in, which it looks like, and we can come to our warnings too, that the only warning we're receiving is from our last step, which was with the San Francisco files. So all of our sheet names came in accordingly. And so what we'll see from our output is instead of just year 2003, that we'll have all of our years stacked vertically, so everything is aligned properly. We can also, again, bring in our browse tool, whether we go to favorites or, navigate all the way over to in and out. And we will drag and drop that browse tool in. And the column I want to specifically look at is the fiscal year. And you'll see for our fiscal year, we have 2003 all the way up until 2012, which indicates to us that all of our records came in accordingly. Now there are practice questions, which we won't go over today. So there's a template workflows folder as well as a completed workflows folder. So if you need any help, you can always reference the completed workflows as a cheat sheet to kind of navigate like the next steps on how to configure the tool. If you want to do the practice questions, there's practice questions for each template that we do. So feel free to, work on those after our training sessions. And if you have any questions, you can always, set up a build session with me as well, or send me an email. But that's it for the reading data section. Is there any questions on that? Awesome. So if you want to save your work, especially for this reading data template, you can use a keyboard to do Control S, to either save it back to, the folder that we have from, extracting those zip files. Or you can always come to this file tab, do save that way, or you can do save as and put your template file in a different folder if you like. Again, mine's just saved to our Alteryx series beginner folder and our training workflows folder to be specific. So I didn't have to, pre-configure the place that it needed to be saved to. But if there's no questions, we'll move on to our last section for today, which is going to be working with conditional statements. So again, we're going to open the workflow by using this browse option. Again, you can just go to your folder too and double click on the training workflow, which it will be this D1.3 conditional statements. So in this case, I'm going to come to my training workflows folder again and grab that conditional statement template. So this is where we're going to start to see how we can use like filters, like how we see in Excel. We can create formulas for the data sets we're working with. That's where, the data types are really going to be, important for when we're trying to configure this. And the first tool we're going to work on is the filter tool. So there's different ways we can configure the filter tool. We have our basic filter, which I'll bring in the tool just so we can see here. We have our basic filter function or our custom filter. So the basic filter will just only filter out on a specific column. our custom filter, we can create multiple different columns that need to be set to true in order for the condition to full around be met. And I see this custom filter used a lot, especially if, we're working with a specific, unique ID that needs to be filtered, but yet there's a certain, other column or value that needs to also be set to true in order for it to be, the correct filtered out data. I know in Excel, there's a lot of times where we filter out on a specific ID, and then from there, we filter out on maybe like the time zone or like the vehicle code. And from there, we have multiple filters set. We can easily just accomplish that in this custom filter as well. But in our case, we're going to filter on only addresses in Boston. I'm going to run this real quick just so we can see the data that gets filtered. Or I shouldn't say filtered, the data set that's being pulled in. So if we see from our output anchor of the input data tool that we have, a city column, which will have, Boston as a part of the addresses. And what we want to do is filter on that city column for only Boston addresses. So again, if we just drag and drop in that filter tool, we'll come to, in this case, we're only looking at one column that we want to filter on. So in our basic filter, we can use this drop down and we'll see all the column headers that are being fed into the filter tool here. So in our case, we want to select city. And now there's two things we could do. One is setting it to equal. So let's say I want to equal it to Boston. I can, do this. And then if we were to run this, you'll see that in this case, our filter tool has two output anchors. We have the true output anchor here and our false output anchor. You can also come to your results window, toggle over those output anchors just to see what the anchor name is actually called. Because if we just look at the output anchor, it just says T or F. So our T is going to be our true, our F is going to be our false. So anything that's not the city equals to Boston will be in our false output anchor. So you can see that's, over 1,000 records that we're dealing with here. Now our true anchor is 46 records that have the keyword Boston in it. So now we're just working with the 46 records here. Now, let's say we want to look for a city that contains the word Boston, but maybe there's East Boston, West Boston, and so forth that we still want to consider. We can use this drop down, select the contains option instead. And if we were to run this again, we should see more records populate in our true output. So now you'll see from our true output that we have all of our, cities from south, east. So those are also going to be considered in there. So super important knowing the difference between the contains and the equals, because in most cases, what I've seen is the contains function used just because you're looking for a specific word, but that doesn't mean that that value only can be, in this case, Boston. It can be, other variations of just the city equaling to or containing Boston. You'll also notice too, when we start to populate a basic filter, that it starts to populate the custom filter instead. So this is, the same function, but it's just a custom filter instead. So if I were to run this, we'll end up seeing, the 51 records again. Now in our next example, we're going to start working with a custom filter. Now there's two case scenarios here, but just for timing purposes, we'll just go over one of them. So in this case, we'll do number one, which if we look at our data here, we have three columns, one called color, one called number, and one called image. So in our case scenario, we want to see all the yellow shirts that have a number greater than 5. So in this case, we're working with two columns, right? We want all the, the color column to equal yellow, but then we also need the number to be greater than 5. So what we'll do is bring in that filter tool, drag and drop it in. And instead of using our basic filter, we're going to do custom filter instead. So how we can create a custom filter is you can either do like an open square bracket and you'll find our, our column name. You can even start typing in the name of your column as well, and you'll see it populate. All you'll have to do is click enter or, click on it with your mouse and it will populate that column that we're looking for. So in this case, we're working with the color equals yellow. So I want to do the equal sign, and then we're going to use double quotes or single quotes to encapsulate the word yellow. So you'll notice that when everything is working accordingly, that everything is color coordinated. If I were to, delete that quote, you'll see that we're start to see like an error message and it says unmatched quote. So that, we can tell that we need to, change that so that, yellow gets highlighted in green again. So we know for right now that that statement is correct. If I were to run this again right now, we'll just see only the t-shirts that equal yellow. But in our case, we want the number to be greater than 5. So we should only see one record come from this, given that our 2 records, only one of them is greater than 5. So we'll add that to our filter tool now. So there's 2 different operators that we normally see with custom filters. The one is using an AND statement, which is our Boolean keyword, or an OR statement. So our AND is used when we want to make sure both of the statements are true. Our OR is used if it could be either or. So it could be either the color yellow or it could be greater than 5. But then in that case, we would see other colors being populated from that. So we don't want to do that in this case. So we want the color to equal yellow, and you can type in and, or you can use the ampersands instead, but I normally just type out and here. And then from here, we want to look at the column name number. So if I type in number, we can see that column populated. So I can click enter, and now we have that number column that we're looking at. So we want the number to be greater, so we'll use the inequality sign, than 5. So now we have our statement color equals yellow and the number is greater than 5. So let's try running this. Now we're getting an error message here. And if we look at our results window, we can see it says invalid type in operator. And the reason being is our number is not a numeric data type. So if we were to look at our data set coming through, again, we'd look at that metadata. And we can see that number column is a V string, but in this case, we need it to be numeric. So what we'll do is bring in a select tool before the filter tool. So you should be able to just, hover over both those, tools, and it should automatically add the tool. Now, another thing I tend to use, especially so you're not messing with any connections, is we can also highlight on our input data tool, right click on it, and there's an option for us to insert after. So if we insert after, we can find all of our tabs that are mentioned in the tool palette. We'll grab the select tool, and you can see it also will automatically populate. So you don't have to worry about setting up the connections or, deleting the connections and resetting them up. So just kind of a shortcut too, if that's something you want to do. Now with our select tool, again, we can change the data types. Since we're working with whole numbers in this case, we want to change this numeric data type to an int 16 all the way up to int 64. Now the difference between those ints is just the sizing. So if I were to do int 16, you'll see the size is 2, and 64 changes to 8. But since we're working with very small values in this case, we can just keep it at int 16 since it's just a size of 2 here. And again, we're just working with, single digits like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now that that's ready to go, we should be able to see a change when we run this. Now, when we run it, the error message goes away and our true output anchor shows that we have one record, which shows us the color is yellow, the number is greater than 5. So we know that this filter tool is working accordingly. I'll stop right there. Are there any questions so far in the chat or any questions in general about what we've worked so far with the tools that we've seen? Okay, so we'll move on. So we have a couple more case scenarios with the filter tool. So I will zoom in on this just because I know I don't have my glasses on and can't read it. So I'm sure it's probably not easier with the small text here. So the next one we're going to do is this filter using a function. So we're going to filter all job titles that contain the word accountant. So instead of us doing something like this where the color has to equal yellow, we're now going to use that contains function again to look for any job titles with the word accountant. So it doesn't have to be specifically the job title name accountant. It could be senior accountant, junior accountant, and so forth. So we'll bring in that filter tool to connect. And then from here, we're going to use our custom filter. Again, because we're only looking at job titles, we could do a basic filter, but I just want us to see how we can use our different functions. We'll also see a very similar kind of pane right here for the formula tool. So if we master, the filter tool using this, we can also master the formula tool as well. So you'll see that there's 4 different icons. Our first one is going to be all of our functions, split into different categories, whether you're working with string functions, working with math, date and date type formulas. The date, I believe I downloaded as a separate package. So if you don't see that, don't be alarmed. You should just see that date time section. Our X are all of our constants. So all of our existing columns and then all the constants that apply to that workflow within our workflow settings. We also have, saved expressions. So if there's any saved expressions you want to use in different workflows, you can do so using this option and navigate to that, and also just our saved settings. So if you want to save this expression to be used at a later time, you can do that as well. So in our case, we want to use the contains function to look for the job title that contains accountant. So you can either type in the word contains and you'll see this function populate. You can also come to FX and look for it here in our search bar, and you'll see that in our string category, that's where that function is contained. So we'll click on that. And you'll see that there's 2 parameters coming in. So our string is going to be the column that we're looking at. So if I delete this word, we're going to type in job title instead. So you should see that name populate. Again, you could also do an open square bracket to look for any of the columns that are relevant to our data set. So here we'll select job title, and then the target is the target word we're looking for. So in this case, the accountant. So we'll use quotes in order to encapsulate this word. So again, we'll type in accountant and make sure to, enclose that with another quote so we see that green text. So now this is ready to go. If we click that run button, we should now see in our true output anchor any, person who has a job title that says accountant in it. So it's senior systems accountant, and, principal accountant and so forth. So just another way to, again, just make sure that you're grabbing the correct data and that we're not excluding any, certain values that should be a part of our, ending results. Now, the next one is very similar. Again, it's just looking at job titles that either have the, manager position that also involves being a nurse. Again, it's just a similar setup to this contains, where we could do it contains the word manager and contains the word nurse, or vice versa. So we'll do this one really quickly, just because I definitely want to focus on the formula tool for as long as we can, just because that one is also really important when it comes to writing out conditional statements. So in this case, we're going to use the custom filter again, and we want to look for job titles with manager in it. So again, I'm going to grab that contains function. We'll type in job title for our string. Our target is going to be manager. And we also are going to do another contains function. And we want to focus on job title, and it also needs to contain the word nurse. The reason why we're not putting them all in one function again is because if we do a contains function where it says like nurse space manager or manager space nurse, it's going to be specifically looking for that that phrase. So if it doesn't contain that specific phrase, then we won't see the correct filtering for at least this practice problem. So now if we look at true, we can see like nurse manager. Now if there was any, different kind of correlation like manager nurse or senior nurse manager, things like that, we would still see that show up in our filter tool here. So now the formula tool, which is one of my favorite tools personally, because we're able to update existing columns with, either new values, with conditional statements that need to be met, or we can create a whole new column as well for our data. So, this formula tool is so great, even with the filter tool as well, especially if you're trying to do like validations checks. The formula tool is great for that. So in our case scenario, we want to create a new column called size. And with our data set coming through, we're going to look at the quantity. So if the quantity is greater than 100, we're going to assign this new row as a large. And then anything else that is, under 100 is going to be labeled as small. So we'll bring in our formula tool, just like how we've done with the other tools, just drag and drop and connect it to this input data tool. Now, again, you'll see a similar setup to what you saw in the filter tool. We have our fx, which is our functions, our x, which is our columns and constants, any saved expressions, or, we're able to save the expression as well. So with this select column dropdown, we can either again update pre-existing columns, or we can add a new column, which in this case we'll want to. So we'll type in size, since that's the name of the new column. Now, if we don't type anything in this box and we start, creating an expression, we're going to end up getting an error message saying there was no column selected. So it's super important for best practices to make sure you label this column, whether, it's just a testing column for the time being. And then from there, we can start creating our expression. So in our case, we want to do a conditional statement. So if we come to FX, there's actually a section called conditional statements. So we're going to use that first one where it's if then else. So we can either click on this, or when you get comfortable enough, you can just start typing it out yourself. But we'll just use this template guide for now. I normally like to segment this out just so it's easier for me to read. Again, you don't have to, just again, matter of preference in this case. So the first thing we want to do is create our conditional statement that needs to be met. So if C, which is our conditional statement, is met, then it needs to be set to true, else false. So in our case, our C is going to be the quantity needs to be greater than 100. So we're going to, again, just like our filter tool, type in the word quantity or use that open square bracket, or even go to this X and look for the columns that way. We'll grab quantity, and then we want to use our inequality sign, so it needs to be greater than 100. We can also check beforehand if this quantity is a numeric data type, just so we don't run into any errors down the road. So we can see that it's set to double right now, which in our case will work for what we're trying to do. So in this case, then we want to set it to true. So if it's true, then we want to set this to large. So with our quotes, we'll encapsulate the word large. And then else, that's everything that doesn't meet that requirement where the quantity is greater than 100. So we're going to set that to small. Now, in our case, because our variables that are our outputs, I should say, for that specific column are going to be string values, we want to make sure this data type is in one of the string types selected. There's different ones that we can use. VW string I see used the most just because that takes into account any like kind of like symbols. Like if you're working with email addresses specifically, you'll want to have it in VW string. So I normally like to keep it like this just because, you know, in case I need to add symbols and everything like that, so I don't have to go back and change the data type. But again, up to you. And again, using that data type reference sheet as a guide to figure out which data type you need in this case. But again, since we're working with string data types, we want to make sure it's also a string data type. So everything is set to go here. We'll again click that run button, which I'm sure someone's tired of me saying that by now. And we'll come to our output anchor. And now you'll see that instead of there being 8 fields like before, we now have 9 fields, which has our new column created called size. And we can also make sure this is working accordingly by if we come to, for instance, our record 1, we can see this quantity is less than 100, so it's set to small. This record 7 is 149, which is greater than 100, so it's set to large. So we know this is working, as it should. Now, another thing I want to mention too, that I forgot to mention before, is this data preview. So this data preview is always going to be for the first record in your data set. So that's why we see the data preview as small here, because that's our first record that will indicate whether it's large or small. So if you see any like null values here and you know it shouldn't be null, then you know that there's something probably going on with your conditional statement that you'll just need to check to make sure that, we're not getting a null right here instead. Also with our formula tool, if you have multiple formulas that need to, or columns that need to be added, you can always click this addition symbol and add new columns. So if I want to do like a test column called test, I can. And what will happen is, all these formulas will then lead to these new columns. So now I have a new column called test. You can also move them around. So like, for instance, right here, you'll just toggle over until you see these arrows. And then you can highlight this on top of the size column. So now this will change the order of which we see it. So we'll see that test column first instead of the size. It's super helpful too, to change, which columns comes first, because sometimes when we're working with calculations, we end up updating columns and then it doesn't have the appropriate, it doesn't have the appropriate number that we're working with once that column's updated. And maybe we have a new column that we need to still use those old numbers for, then we could create that new column, place it on top of the configuration of the updated calculation. So it's still using those old values before that update is actually made to that specific column. Is there any questions on the formula tool so far? No, we're getting close to time. So we have 2 more that we're working with here. So I know we just did the conditional statement one, but now we're going to use inline if instead. So kind of just did an Uno reverse there. But same concept that we're working with, right? So we're wanting to create a new column called size. We want, if the value for quantity is greater than 100, then we want it to be large. If not, it's set to small. So again, it's still working with the same data set as before, but now we're going to use a different function. So for this add column, I'm going to create, again, that new column called size. If we come to our fx and come to conditional, you'll see there's like if then else, if, and then we have this inline if. I will say I see the if then else ones used more, just based off comfort. And also, you'll notice that these are kind of set up the same, but there's an else if instead. What that means is multiple conditions can be met. So even if it doesn't meet, like, let's say the quantity is greater than 100, maybe we want to set the size equals medium if it's, between 50 to 100. And then we'll set another one that if it's less than 50, it equals small, if not extra small. So things like that, we can use multiple conditional statements that need to be met in order for a condition to be true. So we would use this else if statement instead. So just having this already in place, we can just kind of tweak it and edit it in the formula tool instead of having to delete a whole function if we're using the inline if. But if you are working with like one specific condition, this inline if can be, easier to use in the sense that we only need 3 parameters here. So our 3 parameters is this bool, which is the Boolean, the X, which is going to be if the condition is set to true, and then our Y if the condition is set to false. So in this case, our Boolean is our quantity, right? So we want to type in quantity. And our quantity has to be greater than 100. If it's greater than 100, then we want the X to be set to large, which again, we're using those quotes. And then if not, we'll set it to small. So again, just like our record 1 was set to small, we're starting to see in the data preview here that that's also set to small. So that's a promising sign that this is working. So we'll click that handy dandy run button. And now you'll see our output should look exactly like our conditional statement. And with the size column, which is exactly what we want. Again, if it might be confusing later down the line when you're referencing this, if you want to switch the two. So if you wanted to, delete this connection, you could either, connect that one to this one and connect that one to that one. Or if you wanted to align like how I normally like it, I would change these tools and then we'll place this one here instead. So again, this is our inline if one, and then our conditional statement here. Perfect. Is there any questions on that so far? Okay, we'll have one more to do, and then I know we're stopping at 2:30 anyway, so we'll save like the last 2 minutes for some questions. So we're going to bring in a formula tool again, and this time we're going to create a new column called flavor. So we'll already start by typing in here flavor. And in this case, we want if the cookies and bars, or we want cookies and bars to be labeled sweet, snacks and crackers to be labeled salty, and everything else will be labeled unknown. So we come to our category section, we can see what we're referring to, right? The cookies, bars, crackers, and so forth. So in this case, we have 2 conditions that need to be met. So, or can be met, I should say. So either cookies and bars can be met with sweet, snacks and crackers with salty. So we're actually going to use that else if statement now. So if we come to our conditionals section and grab this if then else if, again, I'm just going to separate this just for my own sanity. So our first conditional statement that needs to be met is this cookies and bars will be labeled as sweet. So if we grab our category column, this can equal cookies in our quotes. And just like how we use in our filter tool, the and option, we're gonna, instead of using the and, we can also use that or option. So the category can be cookies or bars. So in this case, if we type in category equals bars, it can be either or in this situation. Now we need this to be set to true. So what will, be our true in this case will be the sweet. So we'll put that in quotes. Now, the else if is our next conditional statement to be met. So in this case, we are looking at the snacks and crackers. So similar concept to what we saw for our first conditional statement, but now we're switching it for snacks and crackers instead. So we'll type in category here equals snacks, or the category equals crackers. Now, our second conditional statement that would be set to true is, again, we want it to be set to salty in this case. So far, if the category equals cookies or bars, then it's set to sweet. If the category equals snacks or crackers, then we want it to salty. Everything else will be labeled as unknown. So again, we will label this in double quotes as unknown. Again, since we're working with string, values for our output, we want it to be set to string data type, so we don't need to adjust this. And now we can just click run, and we should see that new column provided with the appropriate flavors associated with it. So now if we come to our first record, our bars, which again should be set to sweet, we can see the flavor is sweet. For crackers, we have that set to salty, so we should see salty here. So everything is coming out the way we expect it to. And then if there's any other categories that are not listed in that conditional statement, it'll be listed as unknown. We could also grab our browse tool to see if there's any unknown values instead of having to look through all 244 records. So we could either drag in and connect the browse tool, or if we want to right click on the tool, you can also use this add browse after feature. So you don't have to always drag and connect. And now we can navigate to the flavor column, and it seems like we're, using and utilizing all of our categories correctly. So now we only have sweet and salty, and there's no unknown that are mentioned for flavors. But that concludes the first part to the series. Again, you can save this file, just, Control S or file and then click save. We also have those practice questions for our conditional statements. So definitely recommend doing that, especially for the formula and filter. Learning the functions can be super helpful when trying to upskill in Alteryx. But are there any questions for me as far as like what we learned today, or anything that, you can think of that might be a good use case for your own work?
If
Perfect.
nothing else, thank you so much, Taylor. This was awesome.
Yeah, of
Really
course.
helpful.
So I'll be posting this recording on the Enablement Hub, where you downloaded the training files, so you can always reference the recording there. As well as if you have any questions in regards to Alteryx at all, there's a build booking engine link on the Enablement Hub. So you can always book a session with me if you have any, questions regarding the training, or if there's even some use cases that you might need help getting started. I'm happy to help with that. So again, it's right in our Enablement Hub. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next week for our next training.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.